Vishwabharati and Ucha Shiksha Sansthan, as well as the Devi Ahilya Vishwavidyalaya for inviting me and indeed to host this very important inter-institutional dialogue on the theme institutional leaders coming together. Before I came this morning from Delhi, I always believed that power corrupts, PowerPoint corrupts absolutely. And so I don't plan to make a PowerPoint presentation, but I was so struck by Professor Virendra Chavan. I've had the opportunity to hear him for more than 30 times in the last several years, and I've never seen him making a PowerPoint presentation. So I've begun to have greater respect for the idea of PowerPoint. But to disappoint the audience here, I don't plan to make a PowerPoint presentation. I will briefly reflect on the theme leadership and governance. To begin with, I want to say that there are so many ways by which we can speak about leadership, and so many ways we can also discuss about governance. But we should not make the mistake of using the theme of leadership that may be applicable in other settings, especially in corporate settings, even in governmental settings, to equate that with the type of leadership and governance that ought to be seen in a higher education institution. So I want to make a contradistinction between the theme of leadership and governance in education institutions, because that's what we are here concerned about, as opposed to other contexts. I think the first and foremost aspect of this theme is to recognize that leadership and governance matters in all contexts, especially in higher education institutions. Now, the reason for that recognition is not so much for the fact that there is a supreme leader who is going to determine what everybody else is supposed to do, but to recognize the fact that leadership in an academic institution is inherently democratic. It recognizes the need for having a collective sense of leadership in everybody who is associated with the institution. So I want to begin by a very interesting story, an anecdote which may or may not have happened, but it's something that reflects the type of leadership that we need to create in academic institutions. It's about John F. Kennedy. John F. Kennedy, as you know, used to be the President of the United States. So John F. Kennedy had a very charismatic personality. So he would go to functions and meet with people, even sometimes outside the security protocols. So he was one day visiting the National Aeronautic and Space Agency, NASA, and he was supposed to go and meet with the scientists and sort of encourage them on some project. So he had the security staff along with him, and he was walking very fast, very brisk manner, and he walked into a corridor which he's not supposed to, but it's typical Kennedy style. He just walked into the corridor and there was nobody there, and around the end of the corridor there was this man sweeping, cleaning up the corridor, a janitor, we will call a facilities management person. So he was doing that sweeping of the corridor, and then John F. Kennedy just walks up to him. He's the President of the United States. He says, "Hi, I'm John, and what do you do?" And then he looked up, and he of course recognizes that, the janitor recognizes that it's the President, and he looks up to the President and says, I'm Jack, and I'm helping these scientists put a man on the moon. Now this janitor didn't say that he is cleaning up, F2 corridor, or he is doing a shift, he's a supervisor or whatever, but he said that he is helping these scientists put a man on the moon. In that sense, the janitor was a leader. So in some ways, what leadership ought to be in an education institution is to instill the sense of leadership among all individuals who are associated with the institution, and that is where the idea of democratic leadership comes into place. So I want to, since we have only 15 minutes or so, I want to quickly run through some of what I think are important attributes to it. So let me begin by saying that the first and foremost attribute of a leadership in a higher education institution is that he or she ought to be an outstanding academic, a scholar of repute who can lead and promote the idea of excellence. It's an absolutely critical element, because you simply cannot be a leader in an academic institution if you do not have strong academic credentials. You ought to have been a researcher, you ought to have been a teacher, you ought to have got the kind of reputation as a scholar, because what you are indeed engaged in an academic institution is to promote those values of excellence and to build a sense of collective consciousness in the institutional community so that you can create other individuals to raise up to that standard. So the first and foremost thing is that the leader ought to be an outstanding academic. Second is that the leader should be engaged in creating an institutional environment for the development of new ideas for institution building. In some ways, it's one of the most difficult things about leadership is because you want to constantly engage in innovation. You need to challenge existing ideas, but also you want to create an environment in which those new ideas are shared so that the leadership is open to having those ideas in the first place. One of the big challenges of most of Indian higher education institutions is that the leadership is not prepared to create that environment. The leadership believes or ends up believing that all ideas need to come from the leadership, top to bottom, and not generated from bottom, below, and other aspects as other places within the institution. The third aspect of leadership is the leader ought to be a natural consensus builder and who works on the basis of transparency and inclusiveness. Something that is more talked about but less actually understood. In some ways, building consensus in generating new ideas is something that's so critical. Organizations are complex. Universities are extremely complex. There are numerous stakeholders in any idea of university governance. The leadership ought to be somebody who is able to build consensus within the leadership, within the various levels of administration, so that people are able to come together in fulfilling the vision and mission of the institution. The fourth aspect of a leader is to be actively seeking the participation of all stakeholders in the administration of the institution, but also takes full responsibility when it comes to decisions. This is about the twin concept of delegation of powers and principle of responsibility. In a way, this also recognizes the fact that while the leadership is building opportunities for several stakeholders to actively participate in the governance, it's about taking responsibility because you are the leader. Whether things go right or wrong, you are responsible for the consequences of your decisions, and you simply cannot delegate responsibility. In some ways, this particular aspect of assuming responsibility for your actions impinges on the very idea of leadership, and that's something we need to build within academic institutions. And the fifth aspect of leadership is enabling the development of an ecosystem for accepting criticism and empowering the development of new and emerging leaders. Both these aspects are so fundamental to leadership. In fact, the AICTE chairman beautifully argued early on about the need for having different views coming out so that people are able to freely speak about it. Professor Chavan spoke about the importance of speaking truth to power. In a way, the need for building an ecosystem within academic institutions for accepting criticism is so central to the idea of a university. We simply should not shy away from criticism of all kinds. Every idea needs to be tested and criticized, debated, discussed, and even dismissed if they are not good enough. That aspect of leadership is so critical, and the leadership ought to be magnanimous and inclusive and even forgiving when it comes to being part of those conversations. A related aspect is the role of leadership in developing new leaders as a part of the evolutionary process. New and emerging leaders need to be supported for the future of any organization and institution, something that we rarely do in most Indian higher education institutions. Leadership ends up becoming hugely threatened, a deeper sense of security of their own situation affects their ability for building the next generation of leaders at all levels. And that's where leadership ought to play a very significant role. Let me quickly go to governance. I want to share 5 brief ideas, or what I would call the major aspects of governance that will strengthen and shape the future of a higher education institution. First, recognizing the role of effective governance through the twin principles of trust and collegiality in university administration. We don't use the word trust anymore because we somehow feel that that's not something that we should be using in the vocabulary of formal organizational structures. I strongly believe that trust is so central to the idea of university governance. We need to build trust at all levels of governance, and that trust ought to be based upon a need for having respect and collegiality among all aspects or individuals associated with the university. I believe that trust and collegiality will generate greater respect and even acceptance of decisions, even if one disagrees with those decisions. In a time when institutions are becoming more and more complex and the aspirations and the needs for different stakeholders, be it students or faculty or staff, are becoming different and in many ways disaggregated, it's important for us to build trust in those communities. The second aspect is that we need to build internal capacities to promote deep and wide engagement with the 3 critical internal stakeholders: the faculty, the students, and staff. Most of the time, these 3 stakeholders are operating so independently and are not able to understand and appreciate why they are interconnected and even integrated in the fulfillment of the larger mission of an institution. Students end up having their own aspirations and have little opportunities to understand the workings of the institution. Staff end up feeling that they are literally completely at loggerheads with the mission of the institution on the one hand, and somehow they feel they're not treated enough and treated with dignity for the work they do. And faculty end up thinking that they have lesser responsibilities towards both students and staff. And that conglomeration of the faculty, students, and staff, and to how to build that stakeholdership among these internal 3 institutional capacities is so critical. Third is that we need to work towards making the rules and regulations of internal governance as accessible as possible while improving the efficiency associated with decision making on the basis of rules and regulations. I can't help but share with you several of the instances that I've gone through in my own life. I had the privilege to study in 2 good Indian institutions, Loyola College Madras and University of Delhi, after which I graduated from Oxford University, Harvard University, and the University of Hong Kong. And one of the remarkable things about the institutions I associated with overseas were, whenever I had sent an email as a student, I had always received a response from the professor or even the administrator within 5 minutes, at most 10 minutes. On many occasions, I wondered how they were able to do that. And I recognized it was deeply embedded in many of these institutional cultures that they need to be responsive and effective when it comes to these things. Fourth, enlightened engagement with the regulatory bodies to empower the institutions to take decisions in the best interest of the institution. And fifth, to build institutional structures and establish progressive policies that enable outstanding researchers to become part of administration. The last thing is very important, because governance is not about bureaucracy. We need to resist the temptation to look at governance of a university as a bureaucratic exercise with lesser involvement of scholars and researchers. The more and more serious scholars, researchers, and teachers are actively participating in the governance of a university, we will have far greater effective governance within the institution. With those words, I want to stop by saying that the future of Indian academic institutions will significantly depend upon our ability to provide transformative leadership coupled with transparent governance with a deeper sense of accountability to all stakeholders, both within and outside the institution. Thank you very much for this opportunity. I want to particularly thank my dear friend Mr. Raghunandan for inviting me to be part of this conversation. Thank you.